Hi, my name is Balkan Devlen. Welcome to Inside Policy Talks. Today, I am joined by two important experts on the Baltic Sea and geopolitics. Alex Dalziel, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and Henri Vanhanen, from a research fellow at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Policy Talks.
Thanks, Balkan. Great to be here.
Thanks.
Awesome. So let me start with highlighting a recent piece that you wrote for Inside Policy, Macdonald-Laurier's premium platform for policy ideas, focusing on the recent incidents in the Baltics regarding the undersea infrastructure, specifically the incident that took place about a month ago, the initial event on October 8th, the Baltic Connector undersea natural gas pipeline and nearby telecommunications cable link between Finland and Estonia were damaged, which followed by about a week later by a damage to another cable, this time between Sweden and Estonia. This came, as you know, on top of similar incidents in the past year, which highlights an important issue. That is, how are we going to protect the critical undersea infrastructure, be it energy or telecommunication, that actually undergirds most of global connectivity today. So let me start with you, Henri, and then get to Alex. Could you give us sort of capsule of your article with Alex for Inside Policy? What is the problem? What happened? And why are we concerned?
Well, the core issue that we state is that we are living in a reality where incidents against critical infrastructure is becoming more and more common. I mean, I'm talking about hostile actions. And the other thing is that the attribution of these actors, to find the evidence to indicate the intentional willingness behind this, or to just be able to attribute if it's a state actor or not, that's going to be a challenge for us. And therefore, I think for NATO, this demands a new mindset in terms of critical infrastructure threats that we're facing today. Because unfortunately, as we see in the Baltics, in the Arctic, we've seen an increased activity by the Russians. They have the capability and the will. We know that they have been mapping out the locations of wind farms, offshore wind farms, gas pipes, data cables, etc. So the problem here is that we know that the attribution problem, how do we act in a world where we see more and more these types of threats, but we still need to be able to create a deterrent. But the problem is that if we don't have a precedent case of, for example, potential countermeasures, if we are able to indicate or if we indicate either one of these a state actor behind such attacks or threats against critical infrastructure, how are we able to deter them in the future? I think this is the core issue here.
Excellent, Alex. Let me get to you just to give our viewers a quick sort of overview of what happened last month and how this is actually related with several other incidents that happened this year and last year, to set the stage about what I think the central argument that Henri is putting forward, and that is, how are we going to deal with this below the threshold threats as they increase in the future?
Mm-hmm. So basically, in early October, we had some very, very serious bad weather in the Baltic Sea, Finland, Estonia, in that area, with some flooding, snowstorms, etc., across the region. And during that night, this was the 8th of October, it was reported at both ends of the Baltic Connector pipeline, a gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia, as well as transmissions over a data cable, had been interrupted, breached, damaged. Finnish authorities, Finnish president, for instance, quickly came out, publicized the fact that this had been fairly early, obviously done by what was called like an external action. Now, that can lead to a number of different interpretations. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. In the week or so, though, these both basically happened simultaneously, which is the interesting part, or at least in quick succession might be the better way to put it. About a week and a half later, the Swedish government came out and it said one of their digital fiber optic cables extending from Sweden to Estonia had also been damaged, not as seriously, but still it had been interrupted. And even in the last 2 days, we now have a new twist in that the Russians have actually come out and said that one of theirs was damaged as well, which I think we can also get to in a moment. So as part of that, Finnish and Estonian authorities have been leading this investigation, looking into it. It's been determined that through different tracking, et cetera, information, in fact, a Chinese container ship was traveling through the area, I should say a Hong Kong registered vessel, and some photographic evidence, et cetera, shows that it was missing its anchor. Finnish authorities recovered the anchor that they believe did the damage. Maybe as a final point here on the general kind of what happened, that anchor looks like it was dragged tens of kilometers along the seabed, which would be an unusual circumstance, to say the least, for a vessel moving, still moving towards its port during that time.
And I mean, on that point, I think it is important to highlight that, and you mentioned this in the piece, that this ship is actually not an ordinary ship. It actually recently made the news, right? Crossing the Arctic. So it is not a some cruise ship with whatever crew that is not particularly incompetent, etc. You cannot do that sort of crossing without a well-trained crew with some experience, etc. So it is even more unusual to do so. I mean, this is as if if one driver pilot don't know how to parallel park. So it makes it even more suspicious that this is not your off the shelf cargo ship, but it is. Yeah. So it makes it even more concerning that this is just an accident.
Yeah, I think the fact that it was sailing through rather difficult waters, it traversed the Northern Sea route. This is the route to the north of Russia through the Arctic Ocean and adjacent seas between China and Russia. Then going through the Baltic, obviously. So no, this vessel has gone through some. There are definitely some sensitive and difficult navigational areas.
Which makes it even harder. But as you highlighted again in the piece, Henry, I want to get to you on this one. This is, of course, comes after a series of similar incidents. Last year in 2022, we have the severing of the cable in Svalbard. We have, of course, the infamous explosion of Nord Stream 2 pipelines in undersea, and our Danish friends, together with the with our Norwegian and Swedish friends, had an excellent podcast series called The Cold Front. The DR did that, and if you didn't have a chance to listen to it, it is a 6-part, I think, series that actually gets into very detailed how Russian espionage operations and subversion and hybrid warfare takes place in Scandinavia, that highlighted this one. So it comes after a number of incidents in the region that targeted the critical subsea infrastructure. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of those initial events from last year and how we can see a pattern here?
Well, I would look at the development from Ukraine war perspective.
Yes.
In the sense that the ramifications for Russia suffering losses to its conventional military and also to its sort of great power status and its ability to project military and just generally broadly intelligence operations has clearly been severed. The bear is damaged but not out. And in the short term, this definitely means that since it's trying to build back its capabilities, conventional capabilities, this will take years. So this is a long-term development. But the short term is that while this is taking place, it will resort more into, for example, nuclear saber rattling, but also these gray zone operations. This is one way of sort of keeping us on our toes and reminding us that there's a challenge that we have to deal with. But this still goes underneath the threshold of conventional warfare in Article 5, for example, within NATO. So I think this is something we are going to see, unfortunately, more and more. And, you know, for example, this case, we don't know yet if it's Russia, if it's a state actor or not. Mm. But as we argue in the piece, it fundamentally doesn't really matter that much because, you know, this is, let's say it's bad seamanship, which, you know, is possible, but yet seems a bit unlikely if you ask me. There's too many coincidences in this case. But if it's bad seamanship, we still have to, it's still a very good trial balloon for NATO and for others and adversaries to perceive how we react in cases like these. What is our reaction? What is our resolve? So in this sense, as we say, it's to a degree secondary whether it's intentional or not.
Yeah, I mean, just to quote Ian Fleming real quick here, as he the author of James Bond novels, as he pointed out, right? Once is coincidence, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. So we are seeing back to back too many coincidences to take them to be able to explain it by accident or stupidity.
Indeed. And I would also just remind that even though we are now talking about subsea critical infrastructure, this is not just about subsea critical. When we talk about these gray zone operations, for example, in the case of Finland, that shares it's an 800-mile border, 1,300 kilometers with the Russians. In the turn of 2015 and 2016, we saw all of a sudden thousands of refugees being pushed from Russia over two crossing points between Finland and Russia. We've seen the government officials confiscating property in Finland that have been procured by Russians that are in the proximity of military areas and militarily strategically important locations. So it's just the subsea actions and activities. It falls under this phenomena where we're going to continue seeing more and more cases that are sort of not meant to completely take us down to our knees, but to just test where our weaknesses and vulnerabilities lie. How do we react to these? And very often I've seen that this is sort of, you have to give credit to the Russians in the sense that they are able to sort of try to turn the strengths of an open society as their weaknesses, in the sense that, let's say you have disinformation campaigns. Well, I mean, how do you regulate these without attacking, freedom of speech, for example? And there's nothing illegal of buying bad property overpriced, but if it just happens to locate right next to a military base. So I mean, these are the sort of issues that we're dealing with. That most of these things that are being done, obviously not sabotage against critical infrastructure, but some of these things are not illegal or against the law. It's a loophole within the law that is trying to be used in their benefit.
Yeah, so it actually makes it what the Brits would call a wicked problem, right? So it is very hard to deal with, and I think what you highlighted, that the Kremlin increasingly rely on a barbell approach in its relations with the West, in terms of, on the one hand, increasing nuclear saber rattling because of its conventional forces being decimated in Ukraine. Therefore, would continue to rely on its strategic forces, which happen to also be located in the Arctic more and more. And on the other end of the spectrum, increasingly rely on subversion, on hybrid warfare. as you just pointed out, not only the subsea critical infrastructure, but more broadly engaging in subversive activities in the West to take advantage of the open nature of our society. So it's either the very high level threats on the one hand, which by the way nuclear deterrence works, and we know that it works, and we understand that. So that's maybe sort of the easier part of the question to deal with, but what to do with the other end of the barbell is a question which I want to get to Alex here. Maybe two things, Alex. One, could you sort of give a very quick, in a few sentences, sort of overview of why these subsea infrastructure are critical? Why do we call them critical, and why they're important? And the second is just to follow up on Henry's point. How do you see this playing out in a way that the broader geopolitical context and why it matters to Canada?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the basic point about critical infrastructure here, I mean, it's hard to imagine in some sense things being more critical. I mean, people are well aware of the satellite communications, innovations like Starlink, et cetera, but the huge majority of the world's data, the new currency of power, flows through these lines across the Atlantic, the Pacific, through the Baltic, Mediterranean. I mean, this is really the circulatory system for information in the world. So, I mean, these are the high end of critical infrastructure if you think about our day-to-day lives and where the world is going in terms of data integration.
These are new choke points in a way, right? When we talk about shipping and like energy and particularly oil, etc., we tend to talk about choke points in transit, like the Suez Canal, et cetera. Actually, when it comes to data, there are these choke points in the sense that these cables provide an opportunity to disrupt them in a significant way.
I mean, ever since this sort of world of transoceanic cables started, that's been the case. I mean, the British intelligence services, back in the First World War, took advantage of it, et cetera. So, these, as information and data become more and more important to us, these linkages have become more important. And, all these advances, again, we often think of 5G and these things, which, of course, on the more local, regional level are absolutely essential. But the interconnecting arteries of this are these networks or are these cables. And there are going to be more and more of them in the world. As the Internet of Things, as the industrial Internet of Things, as we connect more and more objects to one another and take advantage of that, we're going to see more of this, not less. So what is its relevance to Canada? Well, I think we can look at this two different ways. I mean, certainly in one sense, it's relevant to Canada because many of these cables come ashore in Canada. A number of them there's three of them that come ashore in Nova Scotia, one that will soon come ashore from Japan to British Columbia. We have one between Greenland and Newfoundland. There will be one between Norway and Labrador. And then there's the more local connections. We already have them running up the eastern shore of Hudson's Bay, and that will be extended to the northern tips of Quebec. The province of Quebec in Canada within the next couple of years. The capital of Nunavut, the territory of Nunavut, is in the process of being connected to Labrador. And there's all kinds of these plans, terrestrial, subsea. In the Canadian North, they will appear, and they're appearing everywhere. More and more with time. So, I think we can maybe get into a slightly longer conversation in a moment about, maybe the hybrid structure as it relates to the hybrid threats as they relate to North America and the North American Arctic, because it is a very different environment than what Finland and the Baltic are dealing with, where the Swedish Prime Minister, he was the Prime Minister, so certainly a Swedish government official, senior government official, said, it's like spaghetti underneath the Baltic Sea in terms of pipeline and data infrastructure. So I'd also add to what Henry had to say about the fact that, it's a habit of mind, a human cognitive pattern to look for patterns. And sometimes that's a mistake and making connections where things are not. But unfortunately, because of this hybrid space that we've seen, as well as the stated, strategic intentions of Russia, we do need to entertain these hypotheses and look at them, potentially of whether they fit into a campaign. Again, these are multi-front efforts that we've seen. Henry mentioned the manipulation of migrants and trying to put them into difficult situations and force other states to take them in. But we've also seen, as you mentioned, the investigation earlier this year, or over a number of years, in fact, coming out earlier this year by Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish journalists about, basically the multi-fronts, the activities of Russian espionage services throughout the Nordic countries. We've seen the actions of the various Nordic governments to expel many, many Russian diplomats for activities inconsistent with their status, as we all know what that means. We have, for instance, Nikolai Patrushev, a longtime senior leader in the Kremlin, again, in northwestern Russia near the Finnish border, reviving narratives from the 1930s about, Finns trying to promote separatism and foreign intelligence services, etc. So, the Russian, the Kremlin regime makes these sorts of statements. And we know that they, are always looking for these vulnerabilities. So it is sadly something that the security perspective needs to be brought into.
I mean, I think this is an extremely important point. And I'm a big fan of the word subversion rather than hybrid warfare, because I think it also highlights the fact that this is nothing new. The tools might have changed, but adapted to the new technology. But this has been as a part of a statecraft, as a part of the toolkit for the statecraft, has been with us for centuries. And here, I think the important nature of what you highlighted, the opportunistic nature of not only sort of Kremlin, but also like China under CCP and other authoritarian regimes, where they try to map out these vulnerabilities in order to be able to manipulate and target them when an opportunity presents itself. Presents a particular challenge, because we're not necessarily dealing with, someone sitting in a smoke-filled room and making a 25-year plan to precisely target, the elderly lady on Facebook to undermine democracy. But what they're trying to do is trying to map out the social fissures and physical vulnerabilities in our societies, be it critical infrastructure, be it polarization, be it disinformation, be it elite capture, corruption, etc., etc. And we shouldn't really forget about the corruption component to it, which is integral to the Russian subversion, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere through elite capture. It is an opportunistic mapping of things that can be used later on, and that requires. And Alex, you do have several years of experience in Canadian security and intelligence community. It requires a counterintelligence approach too. You need to be able to deal with these rather than with that particular mindset, right? I think one of the things that are missing, what you kind of highlighted, is this mindset. We're trying to do this above board, and this is about diplomatic relations, et cetera, but it is also about how to identify these subversive activities, whatever the level they are engaging in, and developing, in strengthening our counterintelligence capabilities, sharing those particular information and pushing back, because fundamentally what they're trying to do is to subvert our societies with whatever the means that are available, and taking the opportunities as they come. And of course, Finland has quite a bit of experience dealing with Russian subversion. So Henry, I want to turn to you. When you look at sort of what from the societal resilience part, how can we going to sort of deal with this, below the threshold activities, the subversion, hybrid warfare? What are some of the key lessons that Canada and other allies can learn from the Finnish experience?
Well, for us, I guess it comes from tradition. I mean, obviously, our experiences in the Second World War, fighting against the Soviet Union, you had to mobilize all of the society for the campaign to maintain your independence and territorial integrity to a degree was possible. So it comes from that tradition that in a country with our population currently at 5.5 million and our size, you really have to mobilize all the possible resources to sort of the defending the society in its different fronts. And today it has developed into this concept of comprehensive security that we like to advocate to guests whenever they arrive to Finland. And the point is that you have a very functioning division of labor, connections, communications, and dialogue between private sector and government sector actors. This means that, especially with those companies who have a critical role in the functions of the society, whether it be, food, water, electricity, gas, all these supplies that are mandatory for civilians and people to just maintain their lives. So this is something I think many societies should look into. I mean, obviously, there are tailored solutions. Some countries are bigger, some countries' diasporas are different, and the setting is different. For us, of course, being a frontline country with our, well, like I said, 5.5 million population, which is not that lot compared to many of our other allies. I mean, you can learn some lessons from here, of course. This is the preparedness one is for example, with this case that when this Baltic connector pipeline is now out of use, we have rented an LNG terminal that's going to replace it. And also we had been diversifying our energy palette for years now, for decades now, so that we're not reliant on Russian energy. So therefore, this decoupling between the West and Russia that has taken place since February 2022 hasn't really hit Finland that hard compared to, for example, countries like Germany, who let's just say it have made very big mistakes in the energy politics from a national security perspective, being reliant, and in this sense being enabling certain behavior by the Russians. So you also have to look at these aspects. But I guess the other thing for us is that when you look at from the military security perspective, we have had our conscription service in place. And unlike many countries in the 90s, when the peace dividend and this sort of Fukuyama end of history thinking sort of penetrated most countries when the threat of a grand war in Europe diminished after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we decided to maintain the conscription service. We never really dropped the ball on national defense in this sense. And for years, especially before 2014, Finland was usually laughed upon. Like, why do you still prepare for these old types of wars? Why do you have this conscript service system? I mean, if you look at Sweden, that shares pretty much the similar position that we do geopolitically. And they let go of their conscription system. They downsized their military, and now they're building back capabilities. So this takes decades to build back to a level which you would need now, not only after 10 or 15 years, but you need those capabilities now. So I guess it comes from this preparedness mindset mentality. I know that when, times are tough, then people ask for, money for tanks and defense and guns. But then when, times are easier, then people say, why do we buy these tanks? But this is money out of education or things like these. So I think, there's this certain type of verify and then trust type of mindset when it comes to preparedness, adapting these concepts that really highlight the importance of cooperation between different actors, that they all know what they need to do if crisis comes.
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent point in the sense that we need to be able to switch to what we have been talking about in the Institute for a while, that our society, our companies, our politicians, and our taxpayers need to understand that we need to be paying national security premium. The world is different right now, and if you don't, we will pay. If you don't want to pay pennies today, we will pay hundreds of dollars in the future, and that won't be enough, right? So that is, I think, an important component. Yes. To
sum up on that, the cheapest war is the one that was never fought.
Exactly. So we need to be prepared before it gets there, and that's kind of the notion and that mindset shift. And I think this is quite important. And I don't know whether Alex would agree with me, but particularly when it comes to the private sector here in Canada, we don't necessarily have that sort of way of looking at how their actions, particularly with their dealings with hostile actors, is also a national security issue. So when you're dealing with Russia, when you're dealing with China and others, this is not just any commercial transaction. This is just not any other business. And we have to be able to think about the national security implications on that. So as we wrap up, gentlemen, I want to ask you one last question. What comes next? How do you see the development of under threshold hybrid warfare, subversion, whatever you want to call tactics and incidences and attacks by our adversaries, be it Russia, be it China, be it others, evolving in the next 3 to 5 years? And what is your one suggestion on how can we confront and deal with this wicked problem? Alex, let me start with you, and then we'll end up at him.
Well, I think this is a fact of international relations now. It's not some unusual piece or novel piece. I think we've seen enough now, whether it's Russian interference in U.S. electoral or many other European elections, disinformation campaigns that extend from Greenland to Mozambique, whether it's assassination activities in the UK or Germany, and other words, there's allegations. It never got a lot of attention, but the explosion of a Czech arms depot that they now believe had connections to Russian security services. If you just have to look in the South China Sea and look at China's behavior, using fishing vessels, Coast Guard, etc., to push its ill-founded sovereignty claims in parts of those waters, harassment of vessels, etc., to see that this is just a feature of the way international relations is going to unfold, and this will align, and the intensity will increase as geopolitical tensions increase. The trend lines in Europe suggest that is well established for the coming years. It will take major changes in U.S.-China relations to see it diminish in the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's a fact of life that we need to deal with it. Now, one suggestion, I think in the Canadian context is that we do need to be thinking about resilience. We do need to be thinking about preparedness. We have a general theme, for instance, in the Arctic of building our surveillance and awareness capabilities. This needs to accelerate. This needs to accelerate quite a bit. We need to bring some imagination about how a melting Arctic scenario with increased traffic. It's very low now, but the trend lines will go up in this in the coming decades. Really emphasizes the need for subsea and surface and aerospace protection or surveillance and monitoring. The aerospace piece will get has the NORAD, North American framework for dealing there, but the surface and particularly the subsurface, again, as Henry said, if you let capabilities wither, it takes a long time to build back, and we are in that situation with certain air submarine fleet, and we need to add some underwater sensors to make sure we have the right awareness of what's going on there.
I mean, the best time to do it was yesterday. The second best time is to do it today. The sooner we are realizing it and ramping up those capabilities, the less damage we'll have in the future. So, Henry, let me ask you, what comes next, and what's one policy suggestion you'll have?
Well, fundamentally, it is all related to the question of where does these hostile actions stem from? And it comes from the strategic rivalry between great powers. And for the foreseeable future, we're not really seeing a moment where we would see some sort of détente, unfortunately. And especially in the case of European security, it's the exact opposite, with the current Russian regime enabling itself into this war that most likely will lead to a degree in a diminishing great power status for Putin and Russia, which on the other hand leads to more, I would say, risk-taking and potentially dangerous behavior. And this means that if you ask for one policy recommendation, I would give you the so-called DDR strategy, which is the defense, deterrence, and resilience. You'd have to invest in all of these domains. Yeah, but these are the domains you really have to invest in. Unfortunately, we're not in a time where peace conferences and these sort of trust initiatives are really rising in the ranks. Unfortunately, we don't see an opening for something like this at this time. And I think one also very important thing that we highlighted in the text is that what happens in the next 3 or 5 years is not just something that happens while we sit by and watch. We're actually actively participating in forming the potential path for future, meaning in practice that bad things will happen if we enable them. I think this is the lesson we must learn from the past 2 decades of dealing with the Russians, that we've been carrying the carrot and the stick at the same time. So basically, on one hand, we've been condemning their behavior in Chechnya in the 90s, in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 and in Ukraine. But then on the other hand, we were enabling this with, economic carrots. Russian money was flowing in the banks of London. Gas pipes are being built and other energy infrastructure projects between European countries and the Russians. So being consistent with our approach, being consistent of what we understand that is the threat right now and deterring it and preparing for that, I think this is the key to success.
Excellent. Gentlemen, this has been a great conversation. You have been watching and listening Inside Policy Talks, MLI's premium podcast on everything public policy. I am Balkan Devlen, Director of Transatlantic Program here at MLI. And today I was joined by Alex Dalziel, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and Henri Vanhanen, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Thanks for watching, and continue to follow this space for more on geopolitics and Canada's place in the world, and how we need to be prepared to deal with a much more uncertain and dangerous world for decades to come. Thank you.